Developed through something called social construction. And social construction happens when we create myths around our perspective and our perceptions, and then we create myths around those things, and those myths become more important to us than facts. In fact, they become our facts, even though they're really just myths. The U.S. culture has socially constructed myths and that have attached significant meaning to a number of different categories. White, male, middle class, Christian, U.S. citizen, heterosexual, English as your first language, educated, experienced, and healthy. Those are all things that our U.S. culture have attached significance to. And for those of you who know me very well, you know that every one of those things I have just listed is me. If you look up privilege in the dictionary, you will see my picture beside it. I have privilege, and that gives me power within the U.S. culture and society. If you have power and privilege through one of those categories, those socially constructed myths, there's a strong likelihood that you do not know that you have privilege. In fact, if you have privilege and somebody like me says you have it, you may even want to argue with me, because even if you have privilege, you know how hard you have to work at things. Just because you have privilege doesn't mean everything's automatic and easy. But if you don't have power and privilege, you know very well that it exists, and you know how difficult it can be to not have it. Now, you put on top of the reality of power and privilege the reality that this culture is built on a governance system called democracy. And democracy is most frequently, and I would argue wrongly, defined as free and fair elections and the majority rules. If that is all we mean by democracy, if that is the extent of our understanding and practice of democracy, we're missing the core values of what I believe is a sustainable democracy. That is commitment to the common good. That means the good of everyone here. It is about protecting and honoring the minority voice. It's not just about majority rules, it's also about honoring the minority voice and listening to it. And at a minimum, a sustainable democracy is built on compromise. That's the minimum standard. The goal of democracy is to have generative collaboration, where people who are different from one another work together in a way that creates something that neither one of them could create by themselves. Without those core values and the limited understanding of democracy that it's free and fair elections and majority rules, there's a very high likelihood that we're using the appearance of democracy to support and enhance our own power and privilege. And that's really not democracy. So here's the experiment. I need your help. You're going to need to get up and move. I want everyone who has brown eyes to move and sit on this side, and everyone who has blue eyes to get up and move and sit on this side. Okay? Do I have that right? Yeah. Brown eyes over here, blue eyes over here. So go ahead and move as you need to move. Blue eyes, brown eyes. And if you're not sure if you have green eyes or hazel eyes or any of those kind of things, don't worry about it. Just choose which you're more like, okay? And look around at the people beside you. If there's anybody who's in the wrong place, please tell them to move right now, because you want your side to be exclusively your people, okay? So, blue eyes, brown eyes. Now that we're in this position here, I'm going to offer a few different scenarios, and we're going to go through the social experiment of these scenarios, and then we're going to invite everybody we're going to fly a little drone, not a weaponized drone, just a drone with a little camera on it, and we're going to look down and just kind of reflect on what we experienced in these different scenarios, okay? And in these things, we're going to have you call out answers. If it's just a short answer, we're going to have somebody in this aisle, somebody in this aisle, and I'll be kind of here in the middle. If it's a short answer, you can yell it out, and whoever has the microphone will repeat it. If you want the microphone to make a little longer reflection, you're welcome to just ask for the microphone, and they'll take care of that too. Okay? So, I'm going to start with a drone looking down on us. What do you notice about the reality now that we've split between brown eyes and blue eyes? Yep. What do you notice? There's more brown eyes. Mm-hmm. What else do you notice? Anything else? It's a little more crowded on this side. It even spills over to that outside where here there's nobody over there. So here's scenario number one. I'm going to do a little Robert's Rules of Order thing. I'm going to make a motion. I'm going to ask for a second, and then we're going to take a vote on it, okay? So here's the motion. All brown-eyed people get to go to lunch first. They get extra formation points for being here today, and any faculty and staff with brown eyes get a raise. Is there a second? All right. Everybody in favor, please raise your hand. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Motion's carried. So is everybody satisfied? Why aren't you satisfied? Everybody got one vote, right? Do you think you deserve more than one vote? You do?
Yeah.
Why do you deserve more than one vote from anybody else?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm putting people on the spot. Don't be afraid. If I put you on the spot, you're going to look at me and do this, and I'll let you go. Here's something I noticed over here. Mr. Rocktopali, good friend of mine, back in the back. Mm-hmm. Do you know what? He voted against this motion. Ooh. What do you think about that? Somebody who's a brown-eyed person voted against this motion. What do you think about him? Yeah. What's wrong with that guy, right? Okay. Let's pause.
Yeah.
Let's reflect a little bit on what just happened. Who in this scenario has power and privilege? Brown-eyed people.
Yeah.
Who in this scenario is most vulnerable? Blue-eyed people. Now let me suggest that there's someone in this room who has more power than the brown-eyed people. Who is that?
Somebody said you.
Yeah. It's me. Mm-hmm. Why do I have more power and privilege than the brown-eyed people? Yeah, I'm the one who decided that it's socially constructed importance of what color your eyes are. Before you came in here, nobody really cared what color your eyes were, right? But I created a social construction of saying there's meaning attached to what color your eyes are. Who's the most vulnerable in this scenario? Even more vulnerable than the blue-eyed folks?
Say it louder. The people with green eyes.
Exactly. The people with green eyes are the most vulnerable people in this room because nobody even pays attention to who they are. They're not even recognized as a category.
Yeah.
You see, when majority becomes the whole piece, and the majority sets the rules that are designed for the sake of the majority, I would suggest that we don't have democracy, but we have the tyranny of the majority. Democracy is supposed to be set up to avoid tyranny. But the tyranny of the majority is really not much better than the tyranny of a few. One other thing, when I spoke to people, how did I address the reality that Rock voted differently?
In a negative way, he said.
In a negative way.
Yeah.
And who did I ask about why Rock voted differently? Was it Rock?
No.
No, it wasn't. So by asking somebody else what they thought about what Rock voted, did either of us know why Rock voted the way he did? No.
No.
And that's often what happens in the midst of majorityism. Instead of engaging with the people who are different than we are, who may have a different opinion than we do, and understanding them more deeply, we connect with people in our own alliance and deepen our assumptions about who that other person is, usually wrongly. In fact, we were there accusing Rock of being thoughtless and hindrance of all you people over here, when my hunch is, I know Rock well enough that he was concerned about everybody else in the room. He was concerned about advocating for justice. That's a completely different understanding of a person that we socially created because of the way in which I engaged you in relation to somebody who was different. New scenario, completely different. This time, I want you to imagine that the space in this room, the entire space up to the ceiling, all the way to the sides, is resources. Each cubic foot in this space represents resources of money, jobs, access to education, access to health care, you name it. And we're going to divide this room exactly in half, and everybody on this side shares the resources that are on this half of the room, and everybody on this side gets to divide up equally all the resources that are on this side of the room. Okay? So I want you to think just a little bit right now, individually, who has the most resources individually? They do. The blue-eyed people do. Because you both have the same amount, but it's getting divided up in much fewer ways. Mm-hmm. You have the same expenses for housing, food, all those kinds of things. They have access to more resources. So out of these resources, you're paying for all these things. And remember, I'm the one with the most power here in this room, right? And I'm going to say that whoever contributes the most money and resources to my campaign, when I get elected, I'm going to make sure that the laws passed are going to be beneficial to them. So how does that feel? So this group's probably going to be the one who goes, oh, go ahead.
Hang on. Here we go.
So honestly, like from a standpoint of like a campaign or something, it makes sense, right? To like give back to the people that give the most. But in this setting, it's so unfair because obviously if you have more, you can give more. And then in that case also like it helps a minority. So fewer people.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not what you're going for.
Yeah. So in this scenario, this group has power and privilege. Even though there's fewer numbers, this group is the one that's most vulnerable. Now, you can make the argument that in a democracy, free and fair elections, everybody has one vote, that it still has the power over here. But that tends to be not what happens in reality. Because if this group has the resources to influence media and all those kind of things, it enhances the socially constructed myth that this group is most important, they're most powerful. And this group can get discouraged and not even turn out to vote because what's the point? We know how it's all going to turn out, right? Quick story, an aside of my own experience. I grew up in a small rural community in northern Indiana. We were all white in the community. And as I grew up, Black, Indigenous, people of color were identified as minorities. In other words, people with less power. I've always wondered what it felt like to be in the minority category. And when I had my first opportunity to travel to India, I thought that I would finally have the opportunity to experience what it was like to be a minority, because I would be one of the few white people in that country. But when I got there, I was treated with the utmost of respect and honor, and everybody wanted to honor me in one way or another. And I discovered in that experience that I may have been the minority in India, but I was the privileged minority. And that gave me power even though I was a minority, which is what we're illustrating right here. The socially constructed myths are actually more powerful than numbers. So what do we do with all of this? I want to start by saying we're never going to eliminate categories. In fact, I don't think we should. I think it's our differences and our uniquenesses that make this world a beautiful place. And if everybody only had my perspective, the world would be much poorer than it is, because my perspective is pretty small, is pretty limited. There is more that I don't know than there is that I do know. I'll guarantee you that. But we need to be aware that those categories exist, and we need to be aware of the socially constructed myths that attach meaning and significance to those categories. We need to be aware of power and privilege and vulnerability. Democracy, indeed, is a rejection of tyranny. More importantly, it's the embrace of the common good, which means liberty and justice for all. I believe that true democracy is attention to the voices of the minority and a commitment to protect the voice of the minority. And here's where I want to make a connection to Black History Month, is what do you do when you are the minority and that's socially constructed to benefit the power and privilege of another group, and you're not paid attention to? That's what Martin Luther King Jr. did. He stood up and said, you need to pay attention. You're not paying attention to what's happening to my brothers and sisters who are black. It's called protest. And that's why I think it's important that protests be allowed within the context of a democracy. Because if we're not listening to the minority voices, they should be able to stand up and say, hey, you need to listen to us. This is a democracy, right? Our minority voices are important. You need to listen to us. And we need to reflect together on these socially constructed myths. And then we need to do what I didn't do with rock. We need to engage with one another to talk about and understand where one another's coming from. That's the only way we're going to start deconstructing the myths that are so detrimental to the world in which we live. True democracy is attention to the voices of the minority. It requires collaboration across our categories rather than compromise, or rather than competition. Collaboration rather than competition. Compromise is the minimum standard. The goal is generative collaboration. And that requires self-awareness and a commitment to the common good. So when last drone before we quit? And this one, I'd like each of you to invite the drone to focus only on you personally, not on the group. I'd like you to think about what are the settings in which you are the majority or which you have power and privilege. What do you do with that? Do you use your power and privilege for yourself? Do you use it to support the socially created myth that puts you in power and privilege? Or do you use it for the common good, including the most vulnerable? In what settings are you among the most vulnerable? You're simply not a part of the socially constructed categories, but you may also be those who are simply unrecognized because your category isn't even known or acknowledged. How do you claim your power and your agency in the face of socially constructed vulnerability? How might we engage together in democracy that is so much more than the tyranny of the majority, but is truly attentive and compassionate to the most vulnerable? As you consider all of these things, I invite you, I challenge you, I encourage you to be the change that our nation, be the change that our world, be the change that this campus needs to deconstruct those myths that divide us and that keep the most vulnerable in pain and disenfranchisement. I invite you to continue that reflection through the day, engage in conversation with one another. You're dismissed.